Hello and welcome to the next episode of Python for Chemical Engineering Calculations. In this video I'm going to talk about scope of variables and how to deal with local and global variables in Python. So let me show you an example. Let's say I define a function f1 which defines a variable L and prints two variables L and G. If I run it the way it is right now, nothing is going to happen. I'm not going to have an error, although Python is clearly complaining that the variable g is undefined. The variable g can be a global variable defined elsewhere. So if I don't define it and run f1, I'll get an error saying name g is not defined. However, if I say here g equals 2 and run the same function, the function will print me 1, which is the value of my variable L, and 2, which is the value of my variable g here. So it prints both values. The difference is, however, that this variable L, it's local, it's defined inside the function, and this variable g is global. It's defined in the script outside of this function definition. I can show you where there is a difference. Let's say I introduce another function. Let's say I comment this out and I introduce function f2. Within f2 I define a variable L, print L. Now if I call my function f2, it's going to print my L. However, if I, before calling this function, if I introduce a variable L and say L equals 2, and then I call my function, visually nothing changes, right? So this function f2 still prints this value of L, this local variable. The question is, where did this L go? Well, if I, after calling this function, do print L, it will print me 2. It will print me the value of this L. Well, I know that may look confusing, and actually it is confusing because one should not use the same name for variables with different scopes. So this L is one variable which is local, which is seen only inside this function f2, and this L is a different variable which happened to have the same name but has a different value. So inside f2, the function doesn't know anything about this L equals 2, but outside, after we called it, it doesn't know anything about this L equals to 1. So to be more careful, I strongly recommend not to use the same names for the variables with different scopes. So to change this script to make it more readable and less confusing, just call it g. It will do the same thing, except that now there are two variables, L is local and g is global. So how do we work with global variables? Let me comment this out and introduce another function, f3, which will be printing a value of my global variable g, right? Print g. If I just run it, it will certainly, well, if I just do f3, it will certainly give me an error because I did not introduce g, I did not define g. However, I can define my g here as a global variable and then call my f3 and get my result, right? The question is, what if we want to manipulate with this variable g inside the function? Let me comment this out and introduce a new one. Let me introduce function f4, which will use the certain global variable g. In addition to printing it, let's say it's going to be changing it. G plus equal 1, and then print g. So if I do the same thing now, if I do g equals, let's say, 2, and then call my function f4 and run my script, I will get a problem, because if I try to change my variable here inside the function, Python has a problem with it. It says local variable g reference before assignment. So I cannot simply change a global variable inside the function, but I did not define a local variable with the name g here. So Python is confused and giving me an error. So in order to resolve this issue, there is a keyword global, and this is what has to be used. So I'm commenting these out and introducing a function f5, which will be using the global variable g. Now I'm explicitly saying that g is the global variable. Then it's going to be changing the variable g and printing g. And now if I do g equals 2 and call my f5 function, I'm going to get exactly what I wanted. So I'm able to change the global variable g here inside my function. I'll add 1 to it and then print it. Well, however, this is something I would not recommend using. The keyword global can give you trouble in terms of keeping in mind what is the scope of your variable. So if I were to implement a function which does exactly this, what I would do instead, I would introduce a function f6, which has an input variable, right, x. And then here inside my function, I can change my input variable and print it. And then here, if I want to introduce g equals 2, and then call my f6 of g. And if I run that, it's going to do exactly the same thing as previously, except that you don't need to use a keyword global. You're just feeding these g as a parameter to the function. Well, last thing which I want to show you, which does not have much to do with the scope of the variables, is a default value of variables. So let's say I have this function f6, and I can certainly use it for various values of g, right? It's certainly going to work. And let's say I want to use f6 with a certain default value of the variable. And here is how this should be defined. Defining a function f7, the input variable x, and I can set a default value here, x, for example, equals to 1, and then the function will do the same thing and print x. So now, if I call my f7, I can call it with g equals 2, and I can call f7 of g, right? But I can call it as just f7 without any arguments, without any input variables. Then it will execute it with the default value of x equals to 1. Sometimes this is quite convenient.